With golden shadows, echoes in the night, soft and haunting, flickering light, strings pull tight.
Well, good afternoon. The core of the matter is back. It's been a while since we did a podcast. And we're going to go in a completely different direction. My name is Germaine Murray. I'm a college professor at Maryville University in English and the Humanities. And today our guest is David Murray, who is a writer, journalist for Bound Media here in St. Louis. And he's extremely interested in tariffs. And there's a lot of talk about tariffs. And so here's what we thought we would do. We'd actually talk about what tariffs are, and because I think there's a lot of noise about them, and people really don't know what they are, what they've done, what the history of them are, what kind of consequences they have for the economy, what consequences they have for the consumer. And so thanks for coming here today, Dave. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, very good, very good. So first off, there's been a lot of talk. I don't think I've ever in my whole lifetime had seen so much talk about tariffs, and of course, the president's big thing is tariffs. So do you want to start us up pretty simply? What's a tariff?
So a tariff is originally, it's an Arabic word, and it was a term that meant a list of duties. The duty is the individual tax on something that you're importing into the country. It's a customs revenue, and the tariff originally meant a list of duties, all dutiable items. However, we now use the term tariff to be sort of interchangeable with duty, so that's what I'm going to keep doing. The reason it hasn't been a big topic in this country is that after the Great Depression and the passage of a set of tariffs called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, the effects were so disastrous that it kind of discredited high tariffs for several generations, and that's why most people don't know about them. If you've ever learned anything about tariffs in school, you probably only heard that Smoot-Hawley was bad, and that it had bad effects. And after Smoot-Hawley, Congress, to whom the Constitution gives tariff and trade authority, started delegating that authority to the president in a series of laws and acts, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt, but also with JFK and with Carter, and more recently in the early aughts.
What's really interesting about that is that why did the legislative branch give up its duty and power to the executive branch? We're talking about that all the time, in the last, I would say, 15, 16 years. So it's really interesting. So it's actually their job.
It's actually, according to the Constitution, Congress has sole tariff and trade authority. And there's even a farm state senator named Chuck Grassley who argues that when Congress began delegating tariff authority to the president, it actually violates the separation of powers, and he believes it's unconstitutional. Now he's a big Trump supporter in other ways, so he hasn't pushed the matter, and the whole Congress has to act against it.
By the way, he has mentioned it.
Yes, he has talked about it.
He has talked about it on a number of occasions. I, by the way, agree with him. That's neither here nor there.
Well, the laws that give the president tariff authority are supposed to have restrictions on them, like having to declare a national emergency, or some of them were time limited. I'm not going to list them all. There have been 5 or 6 of them that have granted, again, as I said, beginning with FDR, including JFK. That's the one that there's a 1962 act that Trump has cited, where he has to declare a national emergency and declare that the tariffs are in the national interest. So these restrictions are supposed to limit the tariff authority, but in practice, I think a lot of critics say that it's really a blank check for the president, just impose whatever tariffs he wants, because Congress is not going to offer substantial opposition to whatever the president wants to do.
Okay, so actually what a tariff then is, let's make sure we understand, so our audience knows, a tariff is when imported products, there's a tariff put on it.
There's a duty, a tax, a customs duty that's imposed on them. Now, they never went away. We've had low tariffs. They've always been in the background. All countries have tariffs, so they're not anything new. And we have some of the lowest tariffs right now of any country, between 2 and 3%. And about 70% of all imported goods have no duties on them at all.
So that's really interesting. So the United States has very low tariffs right now.
Yes, before Trump's have kicked in.
And why is that?
Well, after World War II, America set up a new global world order.
Yep.
And one of the planks of this was they wanted to encourage free trade to help other countries see the benefit of capitalism and democracy because they were fighting the appeal of communism. So the idea was we were going to get the whole free world in this network of free trade that in theory was supposed to benefit everybody. We're going to open up America's markets to other countries. They could sell us their goods at a low tariff and it would benefit everybody. Most economists do think that free trade benefits everybody in the long term, but minimal tariffs were still there, of 2 to 3%, and there were always monitored for specific unfair trade practices in particular commodities. One of the things in a free trade system is you're not supposed to sell something for less than what it costs you to make it. That's considered an unfair trade practice.
Right.
And one of the global institutions that the U.S. set up and funded was called the World Trade Organization, which was supposed to arbitrate trade disputes among countries, including tariff disputes. Now, all during the post-war order, the World Trade Organization functioned in the background and handled these minor trade disputes. If some country was selling steel below what it cost to make it to benefit its own steel industry, the World Trade Organization would get involved. Of course, other countries usually retaliated with a tariff to bring their price up to what the fair market price was.
Yeah, we're also hearing about retaliatory tariffs in the last couple of weeks. Right. So America essentially, the United States essentially kept tariffs low
after World
War II.
Up until the 1920s, since our founding, the U.S. was a high tariff country throughout the entire 19th century. Tariffs provided most of the revenues of the federal government throughout the entire century.
Because they didn't have an income tax.
They didn't have an income tax until 1913.
Right.
So that was the main source of federal revenue. Also, we were an agrarian exporting nation.
Right.
Even before the founding of the United States, we were exported ag products. And when you export ag products, you want tariffs to be low because it encourages other countries to buy what you have to sell. And that was the case. Tariffs, before the Civil War, tariffs were a constant source of tension between the North and the South. In fact, high tariffs almost started the Civil War in 1828 because so the northern industrialists who were building factories wanted high tariffs to protect their industries from competition from Great Britain, which was the industrial powerhouse at the time. Great Britain was ahead of us in industrialization. Their goods were cheaper, but our factory owners wanted people to buy American factory goods, so they liked high tariffs. But when you have high tariffs, other countries respond with their own high tariffs, and that kept out. The southern economy was based on cotton and other exports of other agricultural goods, and so the southern landowners and slaveholders wanted low tariffs. Then they could sell the cotton was very important to the world economy at the time. The British were major buyers, but also Russia and other countries, and that's what made the South wealthy. So in 1828, there was a series of high tariffs passed, 30% on some goods, 45% on others, which was called the Tariff of Abominations. Senator Henry Clay, who at that time was of Kentucky, who was the defender of Southern interests, was outraged and gave speeches against it. South Carolina was so incensed that it threatened to secede from the Union in 1828. And President Andrew Jackson passed a law called the Force Bill, or had Congress pass it, that would allow federal troops to collect the high import duties under armed force if necessary in the South. So that it sparked what was called the nullification crisis, because Henry Clay was saying, look, if the states don't like this, we don't have to abide by it. So it was almost a civil war in 1828. Well, Congress fixed those high tariffs in 1833 and lowered them again. Then they raised them again
How much did they lower them in 1833?
It was still what we would consider high today, but they lowered them to the point where they solved the nullification crisis. That was in 1833.
Oh, very good.
And
then they raised them again.
They raised them again.
Well, that's part of Civil War history we never have heard about, because tariffs don't seem to be a very sexy idea. But they're so big right now that I thought it would be a really good idea for us to look at them. So let's launch into the 20th century and the tariff history in the 20th century. So how were tariffs used in the 20th century?
After the Civil War, high tariffs helped shield the U.S. economy, which was industrializing very rapidly in the last quarter of the 19th century. All of our explosive growth happened behind a tariff wall. And Trump often looks back to that era as an example of why tariffs are good. Well, they did. They protected American industry. This was the period of the robber barons and very rapid urban growth in all the eastern seaboard cities.
But it was also a very different time.
It was also a time of unlimited immigration and cheap land still, and all kinds of other conditions that were not the same as what we have today.
Well, unlimited immigration is just now being limited. So.
Right. But in the late 19th century, there were floods of immigrants coming in, providing cheap labor.
Oh, I remember. Yes. I mean, I've taught it. Yes.
So, but the Democrats at that time wanted an income tax. Abraham Lincoln had passed one as a temporary war expedient,
right,
without raising constitutional issues. But when the Democrats tried to pass one, the Supreme Court in the 1890s, the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional. So we needed a constitutional amendment in order to have it, which came in the early 19th century, and then finally the income tax.
You mean the early 20th century?
The early 20th century, I'm sorry, the early 1900s. And it finally came in 1913, which was the same year that the Federal Reserve was set up to provide a central bank for the United States. Right after that, so income tax, at first only 2% of Americans paid income tax. The Revenue Act of Wilson-Gorman, tariff of 1894, lowered tariffs, but introduced personal income taxes on incomes over $4,000 a year. The Dingley tariff replaced the Wilson-Gorman tariff with higher rates.
Okay.
In 1913, personal income tax was reintroduced, and the Underwood Tariff Act lowered tariff rates to their lowest downward revision since the Civil War, because now we had revenues from income taxes.
Now, what kind of things, okay, we got the idea about tariffs in the Civil War and what might have been tariffed, if you will. Is that a verb? I think it is. So what kinds of goods were tariffs put on coming into the United States?
Well, a lot of tariffs targeted specific goods because they were trying to protect specific industries. One of the ones that happened before the Civil War, which had disastrous effects, tried to levy high tariffs on iron goods at the time, including nails and rails, because Congress was trying to support our railroad industry by making it buy American.
Mm-hmm.
So that had a disastrous effect on trade for a while until they revised them upward. So some tariffs single out specific classes of goods. Some tariffs leave some imported goods without duties at all, like we have now. 70% of goods have no duties on them at all.
70% of the goods coming into the United States now
have
no tariffs.
No duties on them, yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
So we're still, as of this moment, we're still a low tariff country. Trump wants to change that.
Well, I forget what date in February. So he's put tariffs, 10% tariffs on China.
In addition to ones left over from his first term that Biden increased.
Oh yeah, Biden didn't increase the tariffs on certain Chinese goods. And then 25% tariffs on certain goods coming from Canada.
And Mexico.
And
those are suspended, but they're just about to kick in now. And Trump just said they're on schedule to kick in. Some people treated them as threats, which could be withdrawn if Canada and Mexico did what Trump wanted. But I think they're going to kick in.
It's very interesting. Very interesting. So the president often talks about how McKinley used tariffs, President McKinley. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, there was a set of tariffs called the McKinley tariffs. They were often named after their congressional sponsors. And that was when McKinley, before he was president, he was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, which was then, as now, one of the most powerful committees in the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
So
it's not the most powerful. Yes.
So at that time, throughout most of the post-Civil War period, Republicans believed in high tariffs. They thought they were good for the country. And sometimes, they were. The answer is always it depends on what else the economy's doing. But we had a financial panic in 1893, and McKinley slowly began to change his mind on tariffs. And by the time he was president, in fact, just before he was assassinated, he had given a speech in Buffalo, New York, about how he no longer thought high tariffs were a way to go.
Now, why? Why did he think that?
Well, because he thought it increasing trade. The trade was, that outweighed the benefits of whatever tariffs you were going to collect. And also they had income taxes. The story of the income tax is interesting. The Democrats wanted it, and President Taft actually supported them as a way to get what he really wanted, which was higher taxes on business. Business really benefited from high tariffs in the late 19th century, and a lot of the so-called progressives, which meant Democrats and Republicans back then. The Republicans called themselves progressives too. There was a wing of the Republican movement believed that business should be paying higher taxes, but in order to do that, you had to lower tariff rates, and then the increase in trade and business would raise the revenues while lowering the rates, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes sense, yeah.
So in 1913, the rates were lowered to the lowest since the Civil War. There was a last gasp of high tariffs in 1922. There was, right after World War I, we had a recession that we recovered from very quickly without the government doing anything. It lasted about a year and a half. The government did nothing except cut expenditures. And economists say it was the last time that a depression was allowed to recover just for market mechanisms. The market bounced back. So then we had the Roaring '20s boom. Industry was on an upswing. And in 1922, the Republicans managed to get a series of higher tariffs passed called the Fordney-McCumber tariffs. They are important, even though they're forgotten today, because they seem to be very positive. They protected American industry again, which was already booming. We had a stock market going up.
Well, tariffs were used to protect American jobs.
And American jobs.
Yeah.
And the Fordney-McCumber tariffs of 1922 seemed to have all positive effects. It was now they annoyed our allies.
What did they tariff?
They had tariffed a whole range of goods at a pretty high rate, and it made it a lot harder for our wartime allies to pay off their war debts with dollars. So at the time of the Fordney-McCumber tariffs, now they didn't help farmers that much. The farm sector had fallen into hard times after World War I and really never came back. And then the Depression hit them even worse. So, but business was doing great. All these new products were being introduced. Business investment was at a record high. Americans were buying cars. Henry Ford had universalized the car.
Well, that was my next point. So tariffs were also frequently used to protect infant industries.
Yes, exactly.
And the country could incubate these new technological industries, one of them being the car, right?
Right. The idea is that to an economist, tariffs are supposed to level the playing field and only protect industries to the point where they can freely compete in an open market.
Right.
After which you don't need them anymore because then it's it's a level playing field. That's the theory. In 1922.
So I want to underscore this. It really does depend whether or not a tariff. It really is relative to what's happening in the economy. It really is. I mean, whether a tariff is good or bad or salutary.
The answer is always
it depends. That's exactly right. So that's really interesting because given the media we have now, everything is totally binary. Everything is either wrong or right or black or white, and it's much more complicated. It depends on the circumstances. So protect American jobs frequently, protect infant industries that are going to grow and develop. And by the way, so these people can compete. So these businesses at home can compete. So that's really interesting. Those seem to be two really important reasons for tariffs.
There's another reason too, which has come to the fore among some of the tariff proponents, which is national security.
Absolutely.
I was going to ask you. There are certain products that are essential to our national security that a lot of people think should be within our borders. We have these global supply chains now.
And what would one of those be?
Well,
chips.
certain computer chips.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're not just using tariffs, they're using non-tariff laws to keep them in this country and passing, the Pentagon has various lists of suppliers who they won't have contracts with
Right.
if they get their chips from certain countries.
Right.
And they basically have banned the import of anything from Red China for defense purposes that has a chip in it or can talk to another part.
Yeah,
Any
so
smart
many
part.
defense industries in this country have, is it the Congress or it has been the president? Is the Congress using tariffs now to protect certain defense industries?
They have not been because,
Okay.
as I said, after Congress delegated
They did, yeah.
tariff, and so
They gave away their power.
right, and so we've been a low tariff. We haven't used tariffs for non-trade reasons. As I said, they've always been in the background. We've always targeted individual items for retaliation if one country wants to dump mangoes or another country wants. They call it dumping if you're selling below cost. That's considered unfair
That's
competition.
an unfair trade practice, yeah.
So that's always gone on in the background, not paid attention to by most people because it was.
But isn't there also another reason for tariffs too, and that's retaliation, right?
Right.
Doesn't that happen?
And
Or
that's-
hasn't that happened?
That's what Trump has said. He wants to use tariffs to compel or coerce non-tariff behavior, that's not related to trade, like securing the border,
Right.
by Mexico and Canada. So, stop your illegal immigrants from coming in, or I'm going to raise your high tariffs. That's one motive. But he's also has made clear that he likes tariffs for their own sake, and that he believes in them for their own sake, not just to get other people to do things.
Yeah. So there are reasons, and it depends. It depends on the economic situation. So that kind of brings us to the present, right? So again, this is a big piece of news. The fact that he wants to go back to using tariffs, because it seems to be kind of an old-fashioned, if you will, an old-fashioned sort of methodology from the past, and he's bringing it back.
A lot of economists don't like it, and you find no shortage of economists claiming that it won't work and it's going to wreck our economy. We can't ever replace income from income taxes with tariffs.
No.
It's just,
No.
that's not possible. That's too huge a
that's
revenue source.
Huge, yeah. But here's, and maybe this is a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, but because tariffs haven't been front and center for quite a long time in this country, is it possible that economists maybe don't have a full grasp, incidentally, of the consequences of levying these tariffs the way he wants to? Because I was thinking, in preparing for this, I read a lot about the relationship of tariffs to inflation. And that's one of the things that that's really in the news a lot, that it will make inflation worse. A lot of economists don't think that's true, and some do. So you have major disagreements within the economist circles, right?
Right. Economists don't even agree on themselves as to what inflation is.
How can you not agree?
It's not identical to just price rises, especially if the price rises are limited to certain categories of goods. It has to do with the money supply.
Yeah, it has
And
to do with the money
that's a big debate
supply.
between the so-called
That is
monetarists.
economics 101.
Right.
That is the economics 101. You print too much money, you're going to get inflation. Absolutely. And that's what we've got right now. We've got way too much money in circulation because that's what happened. But
So the fact, for instance, that egg prices are going up is not necessarily inflation because we have something called bird flu, which is reducing the supply of eggs and so the price. So that's just supply and demand.
yes,
That's
yes.
not inflation. It doesn't make any sense to call it inflation. When the supply of something gets restricted, the price goes up. And that's a normal part of economics. And that's what might happen with some of the tariff goods.
We don't have across the board even consensus, by the way, from economists that tariffs will cause inflation. We don't have that at all. So why do economists think that and maybe if you could use some examples that that tariffs are dangerous for the recovery of our economy?
Well, one of the things that annoys economists is that Trump keeps saying that the other countries are going to be paying them when it's really the importer that pays them, and then may pass the cost. So if I want to import steel from a country that we've imposed tariffs on, I pay extra duty on that steel, and then I can choose whether or not to pass on that cost to the consumer or not. That's what happened during Trump's first term, because he did have some tariffs in his first term. A lot of the economists got exercised about it. I don't think most people noticed the effects of his tariffs in their daily lives.
And by the way, it was apparently Biden kept many of the tariffs.
Biden kept many of Trump's tariffs, especially the ones on China.
On China, yeah.
So either they were of goods that most people didn't buy, or the increases were so small that they didn't notice them. They weren't dramatic like the price of eggs today. So economists will tell you that it did have costs on they can cite all these figures of hundreds of millions of dollars.
Let's underscore that again. So the tariffs are not paid by the country that the tariff is.
No, the consequence for the country is that their goods become too expensive, and
so
we
people
stop
turn
importing.
to their domestic goods. So what Trump is hoping, and this is one of the engines behind manufacturing growth that he wants to develop. He wants us to bring back manufacturing to this country, right?
Right.
And so what he wants to do is levy tariffs against manufactured goods of other countries. So in order to protect our fledgling industries that are trying to come back. Am I saying that right?
Yes, and the jobs that go with them.
And the jobs that go with them. So he's going to try to build, and one of the places, I'm just going to throw this out there, where I would really like to see this happen is, by the way, in the pharmaceutical industry. Because many of our drugs are not made in this country.
Right.
And so, and I don't think that's a good thing, but that's just me. So he's using the tariff in that particular way, or he wants to use the tariff in that particular way, in the way that it was intended to be used. Right?
So he's addressing one of the side effects of the global free trade system that we promoted after World War II, which is that capital is always going to find its lowest cost level.
Right.
If you can go anywhere in the world to set something, you're going to go where the labor is cheapest and the regulations are the least. So that was one thing that critics pointed out about the trade system, is that all the rich Western countries were bringing in all these regulations, and labor costs were getting high because we had unions. So companies went overseas to Asia to find cheap labor where they didn't have to.
Well, they went to Asia, they went to Mexico.
Right. And Mexico and other countries that didn't have our safety regulations and didn't have our regulatory oversight. So we were kind of outsourcing our problems.
So that's really big. Yeah, right. Outsourcing the issues. So what one of his motivations is that, by the way, I don't think that is getting messaged very well. Do you? I mean, I don't. Now, I was going to ask about a couple of industries that you know quite a bit about. So are tariffs going to have anything, are they going to be consequential in with regard to anything having to do with our agriculture?
Yes, during Trump's first term, China retaliated. They imported a lot of soybeans from us, and they retaliated against our soybean imports. And there's something that the USDA has called a Commodity Credit Corporation, which compensates farmers for trade-related impacts that they think are unfair. They have floor reference prices for certain commodities, and if it drops below that, they pay farmers to compensate them.
Yeah.
And so they paid billions of dollars, several $1 billion to soy farmers to compensate them for the effects of China's retaliation. And one of the reasons why China did that, now they still buy some soybeans from us because they can't help it, because they're the biggest importer of soybeans in the world, and they can't always go to Brazil, or depending on the time of year. I mean, Brazil is their largest supplier of soybeans now because they're cheaper. And ours are dollar denominated, which the dollar's high right now, which is another reason. What the currency is doing also has a bearing on tariffs too, because the dollar still is the reserve currency of most international transactions.
Yeah, I don't see that changing.
No.
And I don't think most economists see that changing either, correct?
So ag exporters are going to probably be hurt again in this latest round of tariffs.
And are we getting any reaction from them?
It's been pretty muted so far.
Probably a wait and see.
The farmers are nervous. They don't really like tariffs. Officially, they're all free traders. But China has already, the EU has already had much higher tariffs on a lot of our goods than we have on theirs.
Yeah,
and so has China.
I was reading about that. So can you talk about some of the tariffs that the EU, by the way, has put on American goods?
Yeah, American autos have 15% or higher tariffs to be imported over there.
Well, yeah, and American automobiles they don't have a big market over there because of the tariffs.
No, because they want to protect their own auto industries, and we sort of has put up with that because they were our allies. But it really wasn't free trade.
No.
And the argument by a lot of people who support tariffs is we don't really have free trade now. Other countries are cheating. Other countries have high tariffs. We're just correcting an imbalance. And in fact, that's what Trump said in his latest proposal for what he calls reciprocal tariffs, where he said, hey, we're just going to tariff everybody at the same rate that they tariff us.
Yeah.
And in some cases that's higher, much higher than what we're putting on them now.
So other examples of high tariffs from Western trading partners, can you think of any?
Oh, boy. Autos are the big one. Steel.
Oh, yeah. I was going to steel. And what about foodstuffs, too?
Most European countries, one of the deals we made in this post-war world order was we allowed our allies to protect their own agricultural markets with high tariffs. So Norway, for example, just has all kinds of tariffs completely designed to support its own farmers and keep out competing products. Now, when it comes to non-agricultural, they say they're free trade, but they and Japan, until recently, virtually kept other countries out of its ag markets altogether until the late 90s. I mean, especially they didn't want anybody else's rice coming in. There was a big fight in the 90s over whether California rice was going to be allowed into Japan.
I remember
because
that.
that was part of their national identity. So
Rice,
they grew their own rice, and it was a big moment of national angst.
I remember that.
California rice was allowed in. And we have persistently, tried to get Japan to lower its high tariffs going way, way back. And that was before Trump or before anybody.
Yeah.
So that's one area. Ag policy, we've always had relatively high tariffs there as countries try to protect their own farmers. And, we understood that to some extent.
So that's pretty interesting. Any other like grains or anything like that where soybeans, I get it. What about anything else? Wheat,
all
corn.
grain commodity prices are pretty low right now.
Yes, yes.
And it's hurting the farmers. And the Farm Credit Association just came out with a report about how farm bankruptcies are already accelerating due to that.
Yeah, I know it. That's awful, isn't it? But it's because they've had such amazing boom crops in the last several years. Wow. I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Well, anything else? Boy, we covered a lot of ground. I just wanted to make sure people understood who actually pays the tariff.
Yep.
And oftentimes the tariff is passed on to the consumer, but sometimes the consumer doesn't necessarily see it.
I read something that said that even with Trump's tariffs on steel, in some cases, imported steel is still cheaper than our steel.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
It depends. It depends.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Anyway, this has been really interesting. I got to flex my economic muscles again. I haven't. I did a lot of econ when I was an undergraduate, and thought I should have probably been an economist. But anyway, that's an entirely different. It's an entirely different discussion. So thanks so much, and hopefully we'll see you again soon here, talking about something else.
Thank you so much for having me.
On tap for the next couple of podcasts, I want to talk to Professor John Marino about his fascination and scholarly interest in J.R.R. Tolkien and also Arthur. And he's a font of information. So hopefully that will happen pretty quickly, And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much from the Core of the Matter.